I'd been on the Warship drydock contract for 14 months before anybody up top learned my name, and even then it was an accident. It started the way these things always start, with somebody important needing a ship to do something it currently could not do. The Hollow Crown, the Warship fleet's flagship, sat dead in her gantry cradle, with her drive core dark, and her hull lights guttering like a man breathing his last. Fleet review in 9 hours. The admiral's whole career riding on a 140-meter warship that wouldn't wake up. I watched it from the catwalk above the engineering deck, where the human contractors were technically allowed to stand, as long as we didn't get underfoot. 100 Warship engineers. Real ones, academy-trained, the kind with rank bars on their coveralls and family names you were supposed to recognize, moved through that ship in waves. They ran diagnostics that took up half a wall of scrolling characters I couldn't read. They pulled access panels and argued in low, precise voices about field harmonics and capacitor bleed, and a dozen other things that sounded important, and weren't, as it turned out, the problem. 6 hours of that. 6 hours of pale, elegant people in clean uniforms, standing around a ship that just sat there, patient as a corpse, refusing to give up its secret. I'd worked enough dry docks by then to know the shape of a problem like this. The bigger and more decorated the crew, the more certain everybody gets that the answer has to match the size of the ship. Some elegant failure in the field harmonics. Some catastrophic flaw worthy of 100 trained minds standing around arguing about it. Nobody wants the answer to be small. Small is an insult to all that training. So they keep looking in the big places, the proud places, and the actual fault sits quiet in some unglamorous corner. Nobody's pride will let them check first. I want to say I felt for them. Mostly I felt tired. I'd been up since 4 scraping carbon scale off a coolant manifold 3 decks down, and now I was watching the most decorated engineering corps in this system fail to find a fault that, 9 times out of 10, turns out to be something a child could spot with a flashlight. Admiral Vale Corrith came down to the deck himself, around hour 5. I'd seen him before, at a distance. Tall, the pale lavender gray of the Warship officer caste, a face built for portraits, not for looking tired. He looked tired now. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and listened to his chief engineer explain, very carefully, that they had ruled out 41 possible failure points and were beginning a more invasive teardown of the primary relay trunk. "How long?" the admiral said. 6 hours, perhaps 8. "The review is in 9. Nobody answered that. There wasn't an answer that helped. That was when somebody, I never did learn who, some junior engineer looking for anybody smaller than himself, pointed up at the catwalk and said the access crawl behind the trunk was too narrow for a grown man in full gear, and there were contractors up there who might fit. That's how I got volunteered, not asked. Volunteered, the way a tool gets volunteered. I won't pretend the irony was lost on me, climbing down off that catwalk in my own coveralls with my own kit, while 100 academy men in pressed collars stood back and watched the human go do the part of the job too small and too undignified for them. I've done worse jobs for less reason. I went. The crawl behind the relay trunk is about the width of a coffin and twice as friendly. I went in on my back with a hand light clamped in my teeth and about 40 centimeters of clearance over my face, and I worked my way down the trunk by feel as much as sight, because the light kept catching on condensation and throwing everything into glare. 41 failure points ruled out. I believed it. They'd checked everything that should matter on a ship that size. The field coils, the capacitor banks, the long, elegant systems that take an engineering degree to understand. What they hadn't checked, because nobody checks it, because it's beneath checking, was a coupling joint about 2/3 of the way down the trunk, where an older repair patch met newer wiring. Routine maintenance work, done by somebody in a hurry 8 or 9 months back, probably during the last refit. I found it because my glove kept catching on a ridge of corrosion that shouldn't have been there, a fine white crust like frost, where the metal of the old patch had been quietly eating itself against the metal of the new line ever since the two were joined. Not a fault, just 2 metals that didn't like each other, slowly going to powder in the dark where nobody would ever look, because looking required getting your back on the floor in a coffin-sized crawl space and not minding the smell. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even hard, once I'd found it. I'd seen the exact same corrosion eat through a coolant fitting on a tractor back home before I ever left Earth, and a corroded joint behaves the same whether it's pumping coolant on a farm or current through a warship's central nervous system. I cleaned the contact face as best I could with what was in my kit, and then I needed a shim, something to take up the gap the corrosion had eaten, and seat the new coupling tight. And I didn't have the right part, because nobody packs spares for a fault that isn't supposed to exist. What I had was the lid off my lunch tin, still in my coverall pocket from that morning. Thin metal, the right kind of give. I punched a washer out of it with the tip of my multi-tool, slid it into the gap, and torqued the coupling down over it. The ship's lights came up while I was still lying in the dark with my light in my teeth, and I felt it more than saw it. That low hum a big drive core makes when it remembers itself, traveling up through the deck plate and into my spine. I came out of that crawl looking, I imagine, exactly like what I was, a woman in her 40s, with grease in her hair and a punched-out tin lid's worth of dignity, blinking in the work lights, while 100 engineers stood in dead silence around a ship that was, very suddenly, alive. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then the chief engineer asked, in a voice gone thin and careful, what I had done. I told him. Corroded coupling, old patch against new wire, 8 months of slow rot, nobody had reason to suspect. A washer, 20 minutes, maybe less. He didn't believe me at first. I didn't blame him. I wouldn't have either, if somebody'd told me a flagship's drive core had been held hostage by a lunch tin's worth of corrosion the whole engineering corps had walked past 40 times. The admiral didn't say anything either, not right away. He just looked at the ship, lit up gold and steady all around us, and then he looked at me. Really looked. The way you look at a person, and not at a tool somebody handed you. I don't know how to describe what was in his face, except that it was the look of a man recalculating something he'd assumed was settled. You found this, he said. Not a question. Found it. Fixed it. Wasn't much. Once I had my hands on it. It was everything, he said. I have a review in 4 hours that I would not have survived without it. I told him it was nothing, the way you do, because that's true, and also because I didn't know what else a person says to an admiral standing 2 feet away looking at you like that. He didn't argue the point. He just asked my name, properly, like he intended to use it again, and I gave it to him, and he repeated it back, getting the shape of it right on the second try, which is more than most people manage. Then he asked if I'd consider staying on past the contract, permanent posting, his engineering staff, the kind of position with my name on the roster instead of just a contractor number on a manifest. I told him I'd think about it. I did think about it, walking back up that gantry past 100 engineers who still hadn't quite worked out how to look at me. I'm still thinking about it some nights, lying in my bunk listening to that drive core hum steady through the hull, remembering that the whole difference between a dead warship and a living one turned out to be a tin lid, and 20 minutes nobody else was willing to spend lying on their back in the dark. I took the posting. Of course I took it. But what I keep coming back to isn't the offer, or the rank, or any of it. It's the 4 hours after, walking the deck on my own rounds, feeling that hum under my boots the way you feel a heartbeat under your hand, knowing I was the one who put it back, and knowing, for the first time since I'd come to that yard, that somebody finally saw me do it.